This is Trevor. I'm 34, a truck driver in Seattle, and what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing you wish you could unhear. It started like any ordinary Tuesday, back-to-back dispatch calls, the kind that swallow a morning whole. My little girl Maya, 7 years old, had already been through hell before that day. Still, my mother Helen, 62, retired school administrator who thinks discipline fixes everything, kept nagging me to let her babysit. She said Maya needed family time, that I was too overprotective. Against the knot in my gut, and because I had a 2 o'clock call I couldn't miss, I let it happen. I dropped Maya off at my mom's neat Belleview house at 1. Helen greeted us with a tight smile, and when she looked at Maya's paint-stained jeans and dino tee, her mouth twitched the wrong way. "She couldn't wear something nicer?" she asked, prim and small. I told her the rules. "Keep her away from the pool unless you're right there. Call me if anything feels off." She waved me off. I raised 3 kids. I can handle 1 girl for an afternoon. That should have been the moment I trusted my instincts and left. Instead, I drove away into work. By 3:40, my phone erupted. First Kyle, then Uncle Vincent, then a number I didn't recognize. I ignored them while I was on the call, thinking family drama could wait. Then Kyle texted, "Answer your phone now. Maya's hurt." I dropped everything and bolted. The 20-minute drive felt like an hour. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Kyle didn't answer my calls. Vincent didn't pick up either, a silence that tasted like dread. When I pulled into the driveway, an ambulance sat under the gray Seattle sky, doors open, paramedics moving with that terrible, efficient calm. Uncle Vincent stood on the lawn, soaked and wrapped in a towel, his face drained of color. "Trevor," he said, and I cut him off. "Where's my daughter?" He pointed. Inside the ambulance, under a blanket with an oxygen mask, was Maya. Her lips were blue, her skin pale and wrinkled, hair plastered to her head. I climbed in, grabbed her small, wet hand. "Maya, baby, I'm here." Her eyes fluttered open and then she broke. Silence turned to soft, broken sobs. The paramedic's voice was soft and urgent. "Hypothermia? Possible respiratory issues. We need to get her to the hospital now." They told me she'd been found in the pool. She wasn't breathing when she was pulled out. Someone had brought her back. I looked back at the house through the sliding glass and saw my mother on the couch, hands over her face, Kyle standing over her. In that instant, a cold certainty settled in my bones. Whatever had happened wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a splash or a slip. Maya had already been through the worst anyone could imagine. 3 years earlier, her mother, my wife Rachel, had died in a terrible crash. Rachel was picking Maya up from preschool. A delivery truck hydroplaned on I-5 and slammed into them. The impact crushed the driver's side. Rachel held on long enough to do one last thing, turn to Maya in the back seat and whisper, "Close your eyes, baby. Don't look at Mommy." But Maya couldn't. She watched everything. 12 minutes stretched into forever as paramedics fought to save Rachel. They couldn't. She died before the ambulance reached the hospital. After that, Maya didn't speak for 3 months. The pediatric psychiatrist said it was an acute trauma response, selective mutism, and told us we'd need years of therapy. So when I saw my daughter's blue lips and the ambulance lights that afternoon, something inside me broke wide open. This was not discipline. This was calculated cruelty on a kid already raw with grief. My mother, who once taught other people's children how to behave, had decided the answer to a spilled cup of juice was to teach a lesson by throwing my 7-year-old into the pool. My uncle pulled her out in time, but the damage was done. The paramedics stabilized her, but what they couldn't fix was the betrayal. The person who should have been safe had become the threat. I stood there in the bright, antiseptic ambulance light holding my wet child's hand, every promise I'd ever made to protect her collapsing into the cold air. I don't say any of this for sympathy. I say it because it happened, and because sometimes the most dangerous monsters wear the faces of people we're supposed to trust. I stopped driving long-haul routes and took local deliveries instead. I needed to be there for every therapy appointment, every night terror, every panic that dragged Maya out of sleep. We saw Dr. Jennifer Walsh twice a week for 2 years. Slowly, so slowly, Maya came back. She began to speak, to sleep through some nights, to laugh again. But she never went near pools or lakes. Baths were only okay if I was in the room. Water terrified her. Dr. Walsh called it a trauma association. The helplessness of watching her mother die had fused with a fear of drowning. I told my mother 100 times about the triggers. About the therapy, about patience. Her answer was always the same. You're babying her. She needs structure. She needs discipline. Face her fears or she'll never be normal. Helen had spent 30 years running a school. Her idea of love had hard edges. Kyle won't talk about our childhood. Bridget moved away and barely visits. I'd spent years untangling the damage. After Rachel died and I became a single dad, my mother smelled weakness, an opening to fix what she thought I had spoiled. So I kept visits supervised, never overnight, never alone. I guarded Maya like she was fragile glass. That Tuesday I dropped my guard. I had a job that couldn't wait, and Helen sounded calm on the phone. I told myself she wouldn't be reckless with a 7-year-old who had already been through so much. I was wrong. At Seattle Children's, they rushed Maya into the pediatric ICU. Dr. Christine Lee pulled me into the hallway and said words that felt like knives. Hypothermic. Core temperature 94. Water in her lungs. We're watching for delayed respiratory failure. My voice broke into a dozen pieces. How long was she alone near water? She asked. She wasn't supposed to be near water at all, I said, and then the doctor said what I already knew I had to say. I'm legally required to report this to CPS and the police. Do it, I said. Report everything. 20 minutes later, Uncle Vincent arrived looking 10 years older. He's my mom's younger brother, usually calm, the kind of man who fixes things, so when he sat down next to me, his hands shook. He told me what he'd seen. He'd been in the garage fixing the door at about 3:30, making noise, not paying attention. Then he heard yelling. Through the garage window, he could see the living room. Maya had knocked over juice and markers, child things. My mother was screaming. Maya backed away, frozen. She couldn't find her voice. Vincent tried to go inside, but my mother grabbed Maya by the arm, dragged her toward the back door. She kept yelling about respect, consequences, how the girl needed to learn. I felt the air leave the room as he spoke. Then he said the line that made my world tilt. She pushed her, straight into the pool. My brain stuttered. Maya went under immediately. She can't swim, Vincent said, and my mother just stood there, watching, as if the lesson would teach itself. Then she realized the child wasn't surfacing. Panic finally hit her. Vincent ran and jumped in. Maya had sunk to the bottom. He pulled her up. She wasn't breathing. He did CPR, 90 seconds, maybe longer, and then she coughed up water and breathed. I've never been so afraid in my life. There was more. Vincent had checked the cameras. He told me everything was on video, every shove, every second in the water. He'd downloaded the footage before he left. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket like proof that the thing I feared was no longer only in my head. When he said that, the ambulance lights outside felt like the only honest thing in the world. I held that flash drive like it was a confession and a verdict at once. I took the flash drive like it was the detonator to a bomb. Uncle Vincent's hands were still shaking as he gave it to me, and I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest. I walked toward the ICU where Maya lay so small and fragile under the hospital lights and made myself a promise. Whatever it takes, Helen will never touch my daughter again. I will burn down the life she built if that's what it takes. Over the next 48 hours, I moved like a man with a mission. First stop, the police. I handed Detective Ella the footage, Vincent's statement, and my account. She watched the video 3 times, then looked up with that look detectives get when the truth lands hard. We're filing charges, assault of a child in the 2nd degree and criminal mistreatment in the 1st, she said. Second stop, CPS. The social worker, Daniel Parr, interviewed Vincent, reviewed Maya's medical records, spoke to Dr. Walsh, and watched the footage himself. His face when he came back told me everything. I'm opening a full investigation and recommending emergency protective orders to keep your mother away from Maya and any other minors. Third stop, my lawyer. Jessica, sharp and no nonsense, watched the video once, then set her jaw. We get a permanent restraining order, she said. Civil charges for emotional distress and medical expenses, too. Your mother will regret this. That was phase 2. Bury her, legally, socially, and financially. While Maya stayed under watch at the hospital, I documented everything that could be used against Helen. When Dr. Lee cleared Maya to go home, her instructions were strict. Watch for breathing problems. No swimming, no unsupervised baths. Follow up with Dr. Walsh immediately. Maya hadn't spoken a word since the pool. She'd regressed, Wouldn't let anyone touch her but me. Wouldn't eat unless I fed her. The first night home, I sat on the floor beside her bed, counting breaths like a ritual, terrified. At 2 in the morning, she woke screaming, "Can't breathe! Help, Mama!" calling for Rachel, trapped back in the worst moment of her life. I held her while she cried in silence, then let the rage I'd kept coiled for weeks finally rise. Detective Ella called Friday. "We're charging your mother. She'll be arraigned Monday." Then she told me about the neighbors. The veneers people show the world peeled away fast. Statements rolled in. Helen's always yelling, always harsh, grabbing kids hard, calling them weak and disappointing. The retired teacher 3 doors down said Helen terrorized children at the school where she taught, complaints buried by tenure and connections. Everyone had seen some version of her cruelty and kept quiet to avoid drama. Now their quiet turned into testimony. The security footage was the atomic proof. Jessica had it enhanced and time-stamped. The 47 seconds of video showed every shove, every second in the water. I filed for a permanent restraining order that weekend. Petition, footage, Vincent's testimony, medical records, Dr. Walsh's notes, police reports, neighbor statements, my documented warnings about Maya's triggers. Then, because silence felt like collusion, I sent the video to family with no explanation. "Watch this before you call me." The phone lit up. Kyle called, voice cracking. "I'm never talking to her again." Bridget watched the footage and sobbed, saying she'd always thought they were too sensitive, but this was cruelty. Within 48 hours, Helen went from matriarch to outcast. Her phone stopped ringing. Friends stopped returning texts. The church asked her not to come. The book club showed her the door. The HOA suggested she resign. The family group chat fell silent every time someone mentioned her name. She actually had the nerve to call me. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said, voice collapsing. I cut her off. "Don't you dare," she cried, begging me not to ruin her. I listened to the sound of a lifetime of hard rules breaking into shards, and I thought about my daughter's blue lips in that ambulance. About the scream at 2 a.m., I told Helen, cold and firm, that I would do everything in my power to protect Maya. I ended the call and felt, for the first time, the scale of what I'd set in motion, law, family, and reputation all turning toward a reckoning that would follow Helen for the rest of her life. I slammed the phone down and told her, "Cold is the truth, I don't have a mother." Then I set about making sure she could never hurt Maya again. I hired Jessica and filed the civil case, every emergency bill, every hour of therapy I could imagine, future psychiatric care, pain and suffering. The total came to $977,000. Helen's homeowner policy laughed it off. Intentional acts aren't covered. If she couldn't pay, she'd have to sell everything. 3 weeks after the pool, the courtroom felt like a slow, inevitable thunderclap. Jessica laid out the footage, Vincent's testimony, the medical records, and the therapist's notes. Helen's lawyer pleaded mistake and remorse. The judge didn't buy it. "Your client intentionally pushed a traumatized child into a pool and watched her drown," he said, and the words landed like a gavel of their own. The permanent restraining order was granted. No contact with Maya, direct or indirect, for a minimum of 10 years. 10 years. Helen's face crumpled as the order was read. She looked at me with a silent, pleading mouth, and I returned her stare without a flicker. The fallout spread faster than I'd expected. Neighbors who'd smiled politely in front of her fences now told their stories, the yelling, the hard shoves, the times they'd almost called CPS. The retired teacher down the block who'd once tried to complain at school explained how tenure and connections had buried complaints for years. All those quiet witnesses signed statements and handed them over. The security footage, professionally enhanced and time-stamped by Jessica, was the bomb. 47 seconds of proof that stripped her of the matriarch mask. At home, Maya sank back into a shell. 2 months out, she still wouldn't speak. She wouldn't bathe unless I was there, wouldn't sleep unless I stayed in the room. Nightmares clawing her awake nightly. Dr. Walsh moved us to 3 sessions a week, grounding exercises, safe space visualization, tiny steps forward, and then, often, giant steps back at night. I cut my runs down to local halls, burned through savings covering therapy, lawyers, and medical bills. Money was a cliff edge we fell toward, but the trade-off was obvious. Maya's life, slow as it was, mattered more than any bank balance. Then, After what felt like an endless winter, a small shift. 3 months in, while she colored at the kitchen table, one of the art therapy tools Dr. Walsh used to coax words out of her, she looked up and whispered, "Dad." My heart stopped. When I asked the trembling, terrified question she'd been carrying, "Does Grandma hate me?" I knelt, put the coffee down, and chose words that would not break her. "No, sweetie. She doesn't hate you. She has problems that make her do mean things. But that's not about you. You didn't do anything wrong." When she asked, afraid, "Are you going to send me back to her?" I said, flat and final, "Never. You will never see her again. I promise I will always protect you." She nodded and returned to her crayons. That night, she slept 6 straight hours for the first time since the incident. It was a small miracle, but it felt enormous. Outside our little bubble of progress, Helen was unraveling. The prosecutor refused the plea deal. No probation, no community service. With the video and the depth of Maya's injuries, they wanted jail time. She faced up to a year or more in county, plus probation and a permanent record. Jessica pushed the civil case forward with summary judgment. The sums we'd requested closed in on $1 million, and Helen simply did not have it. Uncle Vincent's updates grew bleaker. She stopped leaving the house, curtains drawn, clutching the phone like a lifeline that never rang. Friends stopped answering. Her church asked her not to come. The neighborhood that had once bowed to her social posture now recoiled. Worst of all was the absence of remorse. She genuinely believed she'd done nothing wrong. That terrified me more than the rest. 4 months after the pool, an unknown number rang my phone. It was Helen, voice raw and pleading. I hung up and sent the recording to Detective Ella. 2 hours later, officers were at Helen's door. Within days, she'd spent 72 hours in custody for violating the restraining order before bail, set at $75,000, bought her out. Justice had begun its slow. Machine, criminal charges, civil ruin, social exile. It didn't undo what had happened in the pool, nor did it instantly fix Maya's nights. But as I walked those corridors between therapist, hospital, lawyer, and courtroom, I felt the shape of something hardening into place, a boundary I would never let cross again. I had promised to protect my daughter. I had set the world in motion to keep that promise. She sold her car to scrape together the bail for the bond. Then the calls stopped. But the desperation didn't. Vincent told me she'd been driving by the house from a distance, scrolling people's profiles trying to find me, sending friend requests to anyone who might hand over an address. She even mailed a letter to Dr. Walsh's clinic asking about Maya's progress. Dr. Walsh returned it unopened and flagged the contact. 6 weeks before trial, Helen's world started unraveling faster than she could scramble. She refused a plea, her lawyer quit, and the only attorney left willing to take her case was a young public defender who looked near hysterical at arraignment. Vincent called one night and said quietly, "Trevor, I think she's having a breakdown." She was talking to herself, barely sleeping, convinced that if she could just explain to Maya, everything would be forgiven. I said what I felt. Maya is 7. She doesn't need to understand why someone hurt her. She needs safety. Vincent didn't call back after that, and I shoved everything else aside to focus on what mattered, getting my kid back to a life that felt like life. By 6 months out, we'd found a shaky rhythm. Maya was speaking more, sleeping more, nightmares still gnawing at the edges but less frequent. Dr. Walsh said we were about 60% back to where she'd been, the kind of progress that felt miraculous and terrifyingly fragile. I'd cut most of my runs, kept only flexible local routes, burned through savings on therapy and legal fees. Money tightened like a noose, but I didn't care. The cost of a steady paycheck was nothing next to my daughter's breath. The trial morning. I didn't plan to go. My deposition was done. The prosecutor said the video would be enough, but Kyle begged me. "It'll matter if you're there." So I sat in the back of the courtroom while the state methodically dismantled any defense Helen's team offered. They played the security footage 4 times, each showing landed harder than the last. Jurors watched a 7-year-old being dragged and pushed into the pool, watched her fight for air, watched the woman who should have protected her stand and do nothing. By the 4th replay, several jurors were openly weeping. Witnesses were brutal and precise. Vincent testified first, steady and devastating, shutting down the idea that he was biased. Dr. Walsh walked the room through years of therapy and explained the setback Helen had caused in one afternoon. Dr. Lee described the medical reality: aspiration, pneumonitis, the risk of respiratory failure in those hours after the rescue. The defense tried to paint it as a panic, a disciplinary plan gone wrong. The prosecutor picked apart every excuse until it cracked. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on both counts. Helen's face drained of color. The courtroom held its breath. Sentencing came 3 weeks later and felt like a shutter falling shut. The judge called it one of the worst things he'd seen in decades on the bench and handed down 15 months in custody and 5 years of supervised probation, along with anger management and parenting classes, though he made it clear she'd likely never be trusted around children again. The restraint order remained. She sobbed as deputies led her away. I met her gaze and felt nothing but a cold, hard finality. Outside, Kyle and Bridget found me, exhausted, hollowed in the way only the people who survive the long nights look. Maya, meanwhile, began to stitch herself back together in tiny, stubborn stitches, asking about returning to school, saying a joke aloud, laughing once at something silly I'd said. The world had punished Helen. It hadn't healed the deepest wounds, but it had bought us time and safety, and that, for now, was everything. For a long beat, we just stood there. Kyle looked at me and asked the question that hangs in the air after something breaks. Do you feel better now that she's going to jail? I thought about it. I didn't feel lighter. Anger doesn't magically turn into comfort, but I felt justice, and for now that had to be enough. We went our separate ways. At home, Maya ran into my arms, burying her face against my chest. The trial was over. The restraining order would hold until she turned 18. We could, tentatively, move forward. Outside our small bubble, Helen's world continued to fall apart, exactly as it should. A year after the pool, there was peace at last. Maya was talking in full sentences, sleeping through most nights, even asking about art classes at the community center. Dr. Walsh said we were about 80% healed, still scarred, still careful, but healing. Pools remained a hard boundary. Baths were safe only with me nearby. Nightmares came, but less often. Small things returned. A joke that made her laugh, a question about school. Life was fragile, but it was ours again. Then the call that made my blood run cold. Helen's getting out early. Overcrowding, good behavior, whatever the reason, she'd be released next week. The restraining order was still in place, but Uncle Vincent warned me she'd been unstable, driving by the house, obsessing over the idea of explaining herself to Maya. I tightened the locks, checked the cameras, reminded Maya never to open the door alone. She came on a Sunday evening. The doorbell lit up my screen, and there she was on the porch, thin, gray, hollowed by months inside, clutching wilted supermarket flowers like a plea. I didn't open the door. I called Detective Ella and kept the chain on. Helen pounded and sobbed, begging for forgiveness, begging to see her granddaughter. Through the camera, I watched her slide to her knees, the flowers scattering, her voice breaking. I lost everything. Please, Trevor, have mercy. I'm your mother. When the officers arrived, she was still curled on the stoop, sobbing and raw. They led her away in handcuffs after I showed them the restraining order and the footage, another violation, another cage. As the patrol car pulled away, she turned her face to me, ruined and pleading. I love you. I love Maya. I met her gaze and said the only thing I felt. You are nothing to me or to Maya. Go to hell. Maya watched from the stairs, small and blinking. I knelt down, explained in the simplest words I could find. Sometimes people who hurt others feel sad when consequences come, but that sadness doesn't undo what they did. Grandma hurt you. She has to live with that. You don't have to feel sorry for her, I told her. She thought it over, solemn as only a child can be, then said, I don't want to see her again. I promised her I would never make her. The next morning, Detective Ella called with more news. Helen would be charged for violating the restraining order and would face additional jail time and an extended probation. 2 weeks later, she got 8 more months, and her probation stretched to 7 years. Kyle and Bridget cut her off completely, and in the quiet that followed, holding my daughter close, I finally felt what mattered most. Her heart beating against mine, steady, alive, and safe. Everything else was noise. Uncle Vincent tried to keep in touch with Helen for a while, but even he reached his breaking point. She just won't accept reality, he told me one evening, sounding worn out. Every call turns into her trying to convince me she was right. That you're the villain. I can't do it anymore. 8 months passed. Maya turned 8 that spring. We threw a small birthday party. Nothing fancy, just a few of her new school friends, Kyle's family, and Bridget, who drove up from Portland with balloons and her old laugh that I hadn't heard in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya looked like a kid again, laughing, running, chasing bubbles in the yard without fear in her eyes. That night, after everyone left and the house went quiet, I sat in the living room watching the soft glow of her nightlight from down the hall. I thought about everything, about Helen still sitting in a cell, about the civil judgment that had stripped her of everything, the house sold, her savings gone, her life reduced to payments from a pension, and I felt nothing but peace. No guilt, no hesitation. Justice had been served and my daughter was safe. That was all that ever mattered,